Hello, everybody. This week, I'm going to discuss the failed modernization in Qing China and Joseon Korea. First, I will discuss the Chinese case. Despite the ups and downs, China had long been one of the most populous, richest, and powerful countries in the world, at least until the West rose and European powers began to project their rising power across the globe. Probably the zenith of China's grandeur, glory, splendor, and prosperity was reached during the reigns of three Manchu emperors of Qing China, Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong. In addition to adding Manchuria, the homeland of the Manchus, which had been practically outside the control of Ming China, the Manchus, by conquering Mongolia, Tibet, and Central Asia, expanded the Chinese territory more than double the size of the old Ming Empire. China's economy was thriving and largely self-sufficient, and it was the preeminent military power, at least in Asia, facing no serious threats on its extensive borders. Therefore, in 1973, when Britain's first diplomatic mission to China, led by Lord George Macartney, arrived, it was treated by officials in the Qing court just as a chance to accept tribute from the distant British while impressing them with the grandeur and hospitality of the Qianlong Emperor. Although Macartney had hoped to winter over in Beijing for sustained negotiations with the emperor, Qianlong dismissed the entire British embassy from Beijing and sent them back to England with no concessions whatsoever. He refused all of Macartney's requests for opening new ports and stationing an ambassador in Beijing. To add insult to injury, he also wrote a famous edict addressed to King George III, in which he even dismissed the gifts Macartney had brought. He wrote, quote, "As your ambassador can see, we possess all things. I set no value on objects, strange or ingenious, and I have no use for your country's manufactures," unquote. Although Emperor Qianlong boasted he had all he needed, this was exactly when China began to decline, at least in relative terms, due to corruption and wastefulness in the court and a stagnating economy. Macartney left China in anger and later wrote in dark resentment that the power and grandeur of China was in fact nothing more than an illusion. Up close, he claimed, the facade of strength gave way to foundations that were rotting from beneath. He said, "I often perceived the ground to be hollow under a vast superstructure, and in trees of the most stately and flourishing appearance I discovered symptoms of speedy decay." He predicted that the Chinese subjects of the Qing dynasty would soon rise up against their Manchu or Tatar overlords. The Chinese, quote, "are awakening from the political stupor they had been thrown into by the Tatar oppression," he claimed, and, quote, "begin to feel their native energies revive," A slight collision might elicit fire from the flint and spread the flames of revolt from one extreme of China to the other, unquote. Within a half a century, McCartney's dismal prediction proved correct. It was challenged by the internal worries and external disturbances. Toward the end of the Qianlong's reign, there broke out rebellions by followers of the millenarian White Lotus sect of Buddhism. Then China was soundly defeated by the British in the Opium War, which began China's Century of Humiliation. And then it was again embroiled in a millenarian rebellion known as the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace. With the threat of Taiping removed, China embarked on a selective westernization program known as a self-strengthening movement. But the defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War showcased the limits of this half-baked modernization effort. After the war, there was another attempt at modernization, but as its name, 100 Days Reform, indicates, it was too short-lived to have any significant results. In this lecture, I will trace the trajectory of China's descent until the nationalist revolution of 1911. Typically, Chinese dynasties relied on two methods of rule: rule by Wen, or rule by ideas, rituals, and ceremony, and rule by Wu, or the rule by brute and force. A dynasty was usually founded with the use of force through a successful rebellion and conquest. But as Liu Jia, an advisor to Liu Bang, the founder of Han Dynasty, said, quote, "You can win the world on the horseback, but how can you possibly rule it from there?" Unquote. In addition to brute force, they needed something else for a sustained rule. Beyond a certain point, force, coercion, or fear may not be effective. For a less costly rule, they had to have their powers accepted as just. For this, they had to win the hearts and minds of the ruled. So they used the soft power of ideas, rituals, and ceremonies. For this, since the Han Dynasty, the rulers relied on Confucian teachings, which laid emphasis on filial piety to parents and loyalty to the ruler. For a time, a balance between Wu, hard power, and Wen, soft power, brought peace and stability. But prolonged peace resulted in little attention to Wu, or hard power, weakening the defense against the challenges from within and from without. In the case of Manchus, dynastic decay appeared even starker. The harsh environment they lived in required the nomads to be physically strong and mentally open toward the outside world just to survive. Physically tough, they could form a formidable army once united by a strong leader, as exemplified by Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire, and Nurhaci, the founder of Manchu Empire. Although the nomads tried to be self-sufficient, they could not produce themselves some essentials of life such as metals, fabrics, and utensils, as in large quantity as they needed. So they traded with their sedentary neighbors to the south. When trading failed, they pillaged to obtain what they needed. And they were ready to take whatever goods, technology, ideas helped them to survive the inhospitable environment. When they entered the Shanhaiguan Pass in 1644 and ran over China, the Manchus were not exactly the nomads they had once been. They lived more or less a sedentary life, but still they maintained their nomadic legacies of martial spirit and enterprising mind. Besides, although it was called the Manchu Empire, in fact, it was an empire allied with the Eastern Mongols. There were royal and noble intermarriages between the Manchus and the Mongols. Manchu army was based on the banner system, which was a hybrid of Mongol military organization and the Han Chinese military organization. The Manchus were quick to adopt firearms. Actually, it was the firearms that helped them to defeat the West Mongols, the Dzungars that had controlled Tibet, and the Uyghurs in eastern Turkestan, which after conquest Manchus called Xinjiang, or newly acquired territory. But in the course of ruling China, they lost their earlier martial spirit and enterprising mind. First, the Manchu rulers became almost completely Sinified and Confucianized in their ways of thinking. A good example is Emperor Yongzheng's handling of what Yale University historian Terence Spencer called Treason by book. This meticulously researched and beautifully written book details a treason case that took place during the reign of Emperor Yongzheng. In 1728, Emperor Yongzheng received a report from a distant subordinate informing that treason in the form of a letter denouncing his rule was hatched. An investigation led to arrest of the dissidents who dared impugn the Manchu imperial rule. Instead of imposing an immediate death sentence, Emperor Yongzheng surprisingly tried to persuade and turn around the leader of the dissidents, a scholar named Zheng Jing. He began an intensive written debate with him. Ultimately convinced that he had grievously wronged the emperor, Zheng Jing wrote an elaborate confession of error. Emperor Yongzheng pardoned him. In another surprising move, Emperor Yongzheng ordered the entire chain of writings, including the original treasonous letter, published and distributed throughout all China as a civics lesson for his subjects. This incident exemplifies how signified the Manchu emperors were and how hard they tried to embody the rule by benevolence as idealized in the Confucian teachings. The Manchus also lost their open and flexible posture toward the outside world. Once in firm control of China, they shut themselves off the outside world, as Ming China had. They paid less attention to keeping up military preparedness. By the time the British sent out an expeditionary force over the issue of opium trade, the country was helpless to defend itself. Another serious problem indicating the decay of the dynasty was the serious level of corruption in the court. At the time of Macartney's visit, the Qianlong Emperor was already beginning to lose control over his government. To Macartney, he appeared clear-eyed and sound of mind, but in fact he was verging on senility after nearly 6 decades on the throne. And though he had, in his earlier years, been a forceful and active administrator, given to lavish displays of power and ego, by the 1790s, Qianlong was entering his senescence and relinquishing ever more power to his advisors. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the rise of his favorite minister, a former Manchu guardsman by the name of He Shen, who had first caught the emperor's fancy and had married the emperor's favorite daughter and assumed to himself a stunning level of power within the government. He Shen oversaw a vast system of patronage through official appointments that funneled huge sums of embezzled government funds into his own pockets. And his corruption was well known to more conscientious officials at the court, but to attack him was to attack the emperor's own judgment in trusting him. Equally dangerous, criticizing him risked bringing to light the dangerous forces of disunity and factionalism at court. So his critics remained largely silent, and He Shen himself remained untouchable. It was only in 1799, when Qianlong finally died, that his son, Emperor Jiaqing, assumed real power and control over the administration, and one of his very first acts was to have He Shen arrested and put to death after a rapid trial in which he was found guilty of a long list of corruption-related crimes. But He Shen was not the only corrupt official. Actually, corruption was widespread, with the emperor losing control, and the salaries of the officials remained trivial for reasons I will explain later. I do not know how many of you watched Bernardo Bertolucci's film, The Last Emperor. If you haven't, I strongly recommend you watch it. In the movie is an episode in which the eunuchs and the corrupt officials stole from imperial treasury, and to conceal their thefts from inspection, they burned down the whole pavilion that held the treasures. It was not an isolated incident. There were several fires that had consumed the imperial treasury in the later Qing period. China had enjoyed great prosperity during most of Qianlong's reign in the 18th century, a period largely free from internal wars in which China enjoyed a thriving economy underpinned by a steady supply of silver from foreign trade, which I will discuss later on. But such prosperity fostered a dramatic increase in the empire's population. And by the end of Qianlong's reign, the empire's population was fully double what it had been under the late Ming Dynasty. The introduction of New World crops such as corn, peanuts, and sweet potatoes helped fuel this growth in China's population, because they could be cultivated on formerly unused land, such as hillsides, hostile to more traditional Chinese crops. By the end of the 18th century, there were more people in China than in all of Europe, and the overall population of roughly 300 million Qing subjects represented near a third of the world population. However, the government was unable to expand in kind to meet the needs of controlling such a large population. Qianlong's grandfather Kangxi, late in his reign in 1711, had issued an edict promising never to raise the land taxes that formed about 80% of the government's income. The rest of the revenue came primarily from a salt monopoly, mining in the southwest, and foreign trade. The decree was a sign of confidence in the dynasty's government at the time, as well as a means of placating wealthy Chinese landowners and purchasing their loyalty to the Manchu rulers. But it was not beneficial to later generations. For Qianlong to overturn his grandfather's act would have been unfair. So the government in the late 18th century had to make do with a very slowly rising budget at the time of fast population growth. The result, which would hold enormous significance for the future, was that the bureaucracy could not expand as needed. At the start of Manchu rule, the population was no more than 150 million. It increased, as I said, 300 million by 800. By 1850, population increased to 450 million, but the number of officials was kept at 20,000. The lowest level of imperial officials found themselves with larger and larger populations under their immediate jurisdictions, and it became increasingly more difficult to judge court cases, collect taxes, and mobilize labor for public works, to say nothing of providing security. It had two effects. First, The administrative needs were filled by yamen runners, local gentries, and an increasingly large number of unofficial personal staff of government officials who were not on the government payroll and were forced to find ways of supporting themselves by squeezing the population, resulting in extortion and corruption. Second, many scholars bribed their way to official appointment, with the number of degree holders increasing while the number of government positions fixed. Even a scholar who passed the notoriously difficult provincial level examinations might have to wait 20 years or more for a position to become available. It was quite natural that those who bought their way into officialdom tried to recoup their investment in one way or another source of corruption. Corruption at the time was rampant, and as we shall see very shortly, corruption affected the national security as well. The dilution of the empire's attention and the increasing difficulty of the landless classes of Chinese to carve out an existence amid a rising population were especially hard felt in regions of China that were late to be settled, where land rights were tenuous. In one especially mountainous region of Hubei province, known as the Han River Highlands bordering Sichuan province, new migrants had multiplied the local population 6 times over during the course of the 18th century, most of them refugees squeezed out from more prosperous and longer settled regions. These migrants made their living as hired laborers, charcoal burners, and tenant farmers. They were by nature unsettled and transitory, and in the absence of a strong imperial presence in the region, disputes were often settled with violence. Many turned to informal groups in search of mutual protection and moral guidance. And they turned out to be ideal recruits for a new form of an old religion, the White Lotus strain of millenarian Buddhism. It preached a coming apocalypse in which traditional society and the Qing government would be destroyed. Believers were told that they would be rewarded in the new world. Itinerant teachers converted peasants who had little to look forward to in their precarious lives, telling them that if they believed in the White Lotus doctrines and if they should chant the proper sutras, those who helped overthrow the corrupt government of the Manchus, they were told, would receive great rewards in the new world that was to come. Those who did not would be swept away in the apocalypse. The White Lotus uprisings began in 1796, at the time when most of the regular local Qing military forces in the Han River Highlands had been transferred south to the neighboring Hunan province to fight a separate uprising of the Miao minority group. As the religious groups in Hubei province began to rebel, most counties in the province had no more than a few dozen soldiers on hand to stop them. By 1799, the rebellion had spread beyond the borders of Hubei and embroiled 5 provinces in a wildfire of sectarian violence. The rebellion continued until 1804 and had disastrous consequences for later disturbances, which I will discuss very shortly. Chinese governments had a long history of dealing with religious uprisings, but White Lotus proved almost impossible to contain. Why? Why was there no quick suppression? A combination of factors hampered the government's attempt to stop them. In the first place, Qianlong refused to send the elite banner troops from the Beijing region. He insisted that the local military leaders must suppress the White Lotus with the local forces. With the regular soldiers gone south, it meant hasty recruitment of local militias, many of which proved even more destructive than the rebels themselves. What the government did do was to lavish the officers in charge of the White Lotus campaigns with nearly all the funds they asked for from the central government. It was here that Heshen's pyramid of corruption made itself felt most severely, for he himself was in charge of the campaigns, and his chosen henchmen supervised the fighting on the ground. An unheralded level of graft entered the military campaigns. By the peak of the war, officers were reporting and demanding salaries for over 1 million militia troops, but many of them did not actually exist, and their salaries were going directly into the pockets of the military leaders themselves, of course with hefty kickbacks to Heshen himself. Even worse, the generals in charge of fighting the White Lotus appear to have prolonged the conclusion of the war for several years after it might have otherwise have ended, allowing the fighting to go on. Why? By prolonging it, they could ensure a constant flow of funding from the government, and they could pocket a huge portion of that government funding into their pockets. In the end, it was only Qianlong's death and Jia Qing's execution of Heshen that allowed a new direction in the White Lotus campaign. Commanders were all replaced. A new strategy of building fortified villages to protect local peasants and using scorched earth to destroy the areas controlled by the sectarians finally proved effective in starving the rebels into submission. But by the time the campaign came to an end in 1804, they had all but bankrupted the government, costing the once flush Qing treasury 120 million taels of silver. How large was it? Well, it's an amount equal to several years' worth of imperial revenue at the time. So harsh cutbacks in military spending followed as a reprisal for the corruption of the White Lotus campaign, and China thus moved forward into the 19th century with a demoralized military and exceptionally stringent limits on military spending. This all but ensured that the empire's soldiers would be poorly trained, underpaid, and have no new weapons or equipment. The aftermath of the White Lotus campaigns would leave the dynasty all the more vulnerable to the conflicts with the European powers and even larger internal uprisings that were to come just a generation later. Apart from the ongoing issue of sectarian rebellion, another big trouble was in the making from what appeared to be an unlikely source in the early 1800s. That is the flourishing trade with Britain and other countries that went on at Canton. I said unlikely because the trade was so valuable to all concerned, as I will explain to you very shortly. Before I do that, let's take a look at the Canton Trade first. China's official trade had always been part of the tribute system, a Chinese way of managing international relations since the Han Dynasty. When tributary states sent embassies to China, they were accompanied by merchant groups who traded with Chinese merchants at the specially open marketplaces at the port of entry. The same thing happened when imperial embassies were sent to tributary states. The Westerners refused to accept suzerainty of China and could not engage in official trade. Of course, since the early 16th century, there had been substantial trade between Chinese and Westerners, but it took the form of contraband trade. In 1760, Emperor Qianlong legalized the Western trade, but restricted it to the southern port of Canton, where the British East India Company purchased vast quantities of tea and silk for resale back home. In this trade, China had long had trade surplus. Europeans wanted silk, porcelain, tea, spices, while Chinese had little interest in importing goods from the West. If there was one thing that China wanted, it was silver, and the Europeans paid in silver for these items, leading to a trade deficit while China had a trade surplus. So there was a steady inflow of silver into China. The expanding trade between China and the West was made possible thanks to the expanding supply of silver. Global silver exchanges began in the 1500s after Spain mined huge quantities of silver in Mexico and South America, leading to the first global network trade. International trade needed a means of payment commonly acceptable to the parties in the trade. At the time, there was no globally accepted reserve currency. So trade transactions were made using the gold and silver. Because of the relatively large quantity of silver, silver was used as the means of payment. And most of European silvers eventually wound up in Asia. So in 1621, a Portuguese merchant said that silver wanders throughout all the world before flocking to China, where it remained there as if at its natural center. Why silver ended up in China? The reason was simple. Westerners wanted Chinese porcelain, silk, and later tea, while Chinese needed very little from Westerners. As you can see in the graph on the right, since the Canton Trade started in the 1760s, British demand for tea skyrocketed. Tea became the single most important import item, surpassing the porcelain, surpassing silk. This resulted in huge trade surplus in the form of silver inflow to China. The taxes levied on the Chinese traders made for a hefty revenue stream at the time of declining Qing government fortunes. Huge contributions, more exactly extortions, of millions of taels were exacted from the Canton merchants to help underwrite the Qing Empire's campaigns in the far west and the suppression of the White Lotus Rebellion. Meanwhile, the high tariffs imposed at Canton also formed a direct revenue stream for the emperor himself and paid for most of the expenses of maintaining his family and household. By the 1830s, one of the leading Chinese merchants at Canton, known to the foreigners as Hokwa, was thought to be the richest man in the world. But please do not think that the benefits were only one-sided. The British government's tax on the East India Company's tea imports provided an enormous stream of reliable income to the British government that comprised one-tenth of its entire yearly revenue. Even when tea imports skyrocketed, the British could pay for them with the silver earned by selling manufactures to Spain and to the New World. As long as the British could secure the needed silver, there would have been no serious problems. But two developments made it increasingly difficult for the British to continue procuring such large amounts of silver to offset their tea purchases. The first development was the American Revolution that started in 1776. American independence stanched the flow of New World silver to England. The second development was the independence wars of Latin American colonies in the first quarter of the 19th century, which disrupted the mining industries in Latin America and caused a worldwide shortage of silver. That ultimately drove the British to settle on a different way to balance their trade in China. The solution to Britain's trade imbalance was opium, grown and processed under monopoly in the East India Company's territories in eastern India. The British could ship the drug to Canton in exchange for silver, which they in turn used to buy tea. Opium in a smokable form caught on in China in a way few could have anticipated. Beginning with wealthy courtiers and bored Manchus, it took root at all levels of Chinese society. Farmers, peddlers, soldiers, monks, officials, and students joined the ranks of its users, with the price going down as the trade expanded. As opium usage spread, the wholesale demand for foreign opiums at Canton increased dramatically. By 1823, opium surpassed cotton as the primary British import from India into China. By 1828, the trade reached a balance overall, with the opium and cotton from India matching the value of the tea and silk that went out from Canton. But then the balance kept shifting in Britain's favor, and China's long-standing advantage slipped away completely. In the first decade of the 19th century, China had still enjoyed a net inflow of 26 million silver dollars or taels from foreign trade. But by the century's third decade, 34 million silver dollars were shipped out of China. Silver outflow also devastated ordinary households that had no opium smokers. To understand this, we have to first understand there had been two different kinds of metallic currencies in use at the time. One was a silver ingot known as taels, and the other was copper coins known as cash. Under normal circumstances, one tael of silver was worth 1,000 cash, 1,000 coins. But with the loss of silver to foreign trade, exacerbated by the global shortage of the silver, its value in relation to copper rose sharply. By the 1830s, depending on location, it could take 1,500 or 1,600 copper coins to purchase one tile of silver, sometimes as much as 2,600. Peasants, for the most part, lived their lives in the copper currency economy. But the land tax quotas were figured in silver. Therefore, their effective taxes and rents rose as the copper coinage they possessed lost its value relative to the silver they owed. So, even without the healthy effects of the opium trade, the currency imbalance caused many families and landowners in South China to slip into poverty as their money became worth less and less until it was no longer sufficient to meet their heavy tax burdens. Naturally, China demanded the British stop opium smuggling, but the British did not comply with those demands. This ultimately led to the Opium War. By the late 1830s, the Qing government decided, after a brief flirtation with the idea of legalizing the opium trade, to interdict opium. A fiery and energetic official named Lin Zexu was sent to Canton as the emperor's personal representative to rid China of the opium problem once and for all. Arriving in March of 1839, Commissioner Lin first took action against the Chinese dealers and users in the city, arresting nearly 2,000 of the former and opening sanitaria for the latter to break their addictions. Then he turned to the British traders and demanded that they hand over their opium stocks and sign a pledge never to sell the drug again. When his deadline passed with no action on the part of the foreigners, Lin blockaded the foreign factory area in Canton, trapping several foreigners inside, including the British Superintendent of Trade, Charles Elliot. After several weeks passed, foreigners in the surrounded factories began running out of food and supplies, and Elliot decided that he would simply give Commissioner Lin exactly what he wanted. However, in his official capacity, Elliot issued a proclamation making all the opium in Canton the property of the British Crown and no longer the property of the private traders. Of course, his motive was simple. If Commissioner Lin trifled with Crown's property, it would be sheer effrontery to Her Majesty. This in turn would constitute a Chinese provocation and serve as a perfect pretext and justification for war with the Chinese. The handed over opium totaled more than 1,300 tons, packed in some 20,000 or some chests. Over the course of 23 days, Commissioner Lin had the entire stock of foreign opium destroyed. His workers dissolved it into a mixture of water, lime, and salt, and then washed it out to sea. Elliot then reported this outrage to the British government. In Britain, there were heated debates for and against the military action in the parliament and in the mass media. But in the end, economic interests won over moral arguments by a hair's breadth. By a margin of only 9 votes out of more than 500 votes cast, the House of Commons defeated a motion of censure against Foreign Minister Lord Palmerston and the other ministers of government. This effectively gave them a parliamentary endorsement of their war in China. The British declared war against China in early 1840. A British war fleet of 16 naval vessels, 4 armed steamers, 27 transports, and 4,000 soldiers arrived in the South China Sea in June of 1840. It was a one-sided war, for the Qing dynasty had always faced its most serious threats on land, and it possessed virtually no navy to speak of. Even on land, the better armed and better trained British forces could easily rout the Qing defenders. In one instance, one British company successfully defeated 50,000 strong Qing forces. It was not surprising, considering they were mostly made of hastily mobilized peasants who ran away once hostilities started. The British first blockaded Canton, then they made war up the coast, capturing the island of Zhoushan and fighting their way all the way up to Dagu Force in Tianjin, which guarded the way to Beijing. Blaming Lin Zexu for provoking an unwanted war, the emperor had him stripped of rank and sent into exile. He replaced Lin with a more conciliatory negotiator who settled an initial peace agreement in January of 1841. Unfortunately, however, the agreement satisfied neither side. The Chinese felt they had granted too much, and the British felt they had not demanded enough. Therefore, the war resumed again, with 10,000 more British troops being brought in from India. In February of 1841, the British laid siege to Canton, which was ransomed for 6 million silver dollars, paid mostly by the Chinese merchants of the city. The British continued to fight their way up the coast, then up the Yangtze River, and finally threatened the major city of Nanjing. At this point, the Chinese finally surrendered and signed a treaty on August 29, 1841, to end the war. The Treaty of Nanking or Nanjing dismantled the old Canton system, opened four more ports: Xiamen, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, in addition to Canton as a treaty port. In these ports, the British could live year-round. In the past, they could stay only during the trading season. The British could rent property, the British could build homes, offices, and warehouses, and the British could station consuls, and British were to largely govern themselves. Tariffs were made more consistent, and the British cities were granted extraterritoriality. That is, while in the treaty ports, they would be subject only to the British law. Britain also took Hong Kong as a full-fledged colony. Finally, China had to pay a massive indemnity which totaled 21 million silver dollars, both as a compensation for the opium Commissioner Lin had destroyed in 1839, and as a payment for Britain's costs in mounting the war. Over the next few years, China would sign similar treaties with Americans and French, giving them the same rights as the British had won in China, and guaranteeing them status as most favored nation. Treaty of Nanking was the first of the humiliating, unequal treaties imposed on China by Western powers. So the Treaty of Nanking endures in infamy in the modern Chinese nationalistic consciousness. This was the treaty that began it all, that led to China's descent from the rarefied heights of a celestial court to a terrestrial nadir as the Xingmen of Asia. Since it gets too long, I will stop here. I will continue my lecture very shortly.